Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for my Socialism song series. This is my second last commentary, and today we're going to talk about Saul Alinsky, as I promised in my last video, a little bit more about him. I decided I'm going to not go too much into even who he was. I just want to cover his 12 rules for radicals, because I think if you are willing and open to listen to this, you'll understand a lot more of what's been going on in the political climate of recent years especially, but the last few decades, to be honest. This has been a really interesting, I'll get to those rules very soon here, but this has been a very interesting theme for me, and I've learned a lot. I knew I had to share these songs because they came from a very deep, honest place through my own experience with the suffering of people I knew personally. And hearing their stories, doing a lot of reading myself. And I knew I had to talk about it as well. And I needed to be able to contextualize these songs properly. But originally I wrote them specifically about communism, but I made the distinct decision to call it the Socialism song series because I know that a lot of people will say socialism's not the same thing as communism. And I can only say that what started as an inner conviction at the beginning has grown to be emphatically proven in all of my research. I know that these are peripheral sort of videos, but they're already too long. So I'm just going to come back to my goal that I've stated a few times, which is just to get you thinking. I would love if you would do your own research and learn more about the things I'm talking about, because in the end, I believe the facts are in my favor. I think that we haven't been taught the realities of this history, which is really tragic and it's wrong. These are not profoundly in-depth commentaries. I've done a lot of academic work, and I wouldn't classify this as deep academic work. But what I realized was that there's been such a gap in our education, and very few people know anything of any real depth about the Nazis. They know the peripheral statistics, and they know enough of the stories that they were convicted that it's an ideology that should be thrown out permanently from civil discourse in any kind of civil society. And my great hope is that that same reality should be applied to any kind of Marxist ideology. The modest estimate, like I've mentioned a few times, is that 100 million people have died as a result of the application of this ideology. And a lot of people will would critique me, for example, and many others who use socialism and communism interchangeably. But they really have to check themselves because, first of all, every major leader that's been convinced that this is a good thing uses them almost interchangeably. It seems to be sort of the case that socialism is a pathway to the completion of communism, as Lenin himself would say. And even recently somebody commented on one of my posts on Instagram, and he was from Venezuela, and he said specifically, democratic socialism ruined my country. He didn't say socialism, he didn't say communism, he said democratic socialism. And that's the term we're seeing. In addition, somebody sent me a link to a website about democratic socialism in the US, and they are subtle about it, but they admit that they would like the eventual obliteration of private property and market capitalism. So for everything that gets thrown around about how it's not the same thing, I think I can categorically say at this point that I started with some openness to democratic socialism under a different name, sort of. Like high-tax capitalism is how I've heard it spoken about. But I think at this time, as a civilization, we have to throw out socialism, communism, Marxism, and another word I encountered that is often a cover for words like socialism or communism is progressives. And again, do your research, but this is not stuff I'm making up. This is stuff that comes from the people themselves who hold this ideology and feel justified in accomplishing it at any cost. You can check out some of my other videos for more information on that, and I do have another video. I will be doing the last commentary of my series that will just be about the stats and stories that I feel need to be shared to give some context for this ideology. Again, I just want to be clear, I'm not talking about every person who votes sort of in this direction or feels moved in that direction, but the radicals committed to the ideology. And my hope is that you will start to see, as I'm reflecting on these 12 rules here, these markers in your society and maybe how they've affected the political conversation, particularly the polarization in recent years, and how they have set the tone for civil discourse. I think you'll be pretty amazed if you have an open heart and an open mind to listen right now, how many applications these things have. And you have to keep in mind, this is stuff that was written and applied as early as the 60s and has been at work for since then, so 60 years. And we're seeing the full fruit of this now. So let's get to Saul Alinsky's 12 rules. The ones that I don't have much of a commentary for, I'm just going to name and move on from and let you pursue a bit more information about. I will expand on a few. Just because it's of note, a lot of people say, oh, that's not a worthy point to make, but it should be spoken that Saul Alinsky dedicated this book to Lucifer. And if you're not a religious person, maybe you think that's not a big deal. If you are, I think it's just another sign that this is not something we want to be a part of. So, here we go. Saul Alinsky's 12 rules for radicals. Rule number 1. Power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. So it's basically a system of bluffing your way into power. And I don't know, anybody that's from a small town, they still have them. They call them false fronts. You have these, basically the front of the store is 2 stories, but the store itself is only 1 story. And the idea was to sort of look like you were a bigger, more important store than you were. And the thing about this rule is that if people are convinced you have power and influence, then suddenly you have power and influence. It's a funny thing how that works. It's kind of like the fake it till you make it principle. So you have to talk big and present big and come forward with confidence and like you've got everything under control and you know that this is right and all of that. And eventually you accomplish what you're trying to signal. Okay, so false fronts. Rule number 1. Rule number 2. Never go outside the expertise of your people. When you lack expertise, you lack confidence. And so when you see sort of conversations or political discourse that seems to just be in loops, it's because you're dealing with ideologues that only frame everything within a very narrow understanding of the world because that's all they know. They're not interdisciplinarians, or they're not concerned with trying to be, because that's not their end game. Their end game is accomplishing an agenda, and they know their talking points. So if you've ever done any media work, this is an interesting thing that everybody takes part in, is sort of staying focused on message, but it's to the extreme. And it's to avoid having to feel any kind of fear or threat. So of course this takes civil discourse completely off the table, but that's the goal. That is the goal, is to take it out of the realm of the reasonable and put it into just where you can feel constantly secure. Rule number 3 is, whenever possible, go outside of the expertise of the enemy. So this is the same rule but flipped. So while you're trying to bolster your own confidence by only talking about the things that you know and have confidence in and always moving the conversation back to that, particularly with the slogans or sort of the trump cards that people think they have, like the slogans, like I won't get into specifics. But when you can force those you're talking to go outside of what they know, then you're actually facilitating their lack of confidence and you're bolstering your own, making them unbalanced and lacking confidence and causing that anxiety that you're trying to avoid. Rule number 4, and just so it's said, I'm not really saying much at all about these rules. I think some of them are very obviously malicious things to do to people, but for the most part, I'm just telling you the playbook of the radical left so that you can start to have eyes to see these things at work in culture. And so I'm intentionally not going to close the loop on the application of these rules because, first of all, I believe that you're capable of doing that yourself. And I don't want to get pulled away by specific examples because I think it undercuts the overall message I'm trying to accomplish, which is just to give you eyes to see reality a bit better. And I don't have false notions, as I mentioned before, of convincing everybody in one fell swoop, but I would be delighted to get people thinking more critically about the culture we're in, and even just getting on board with the basic idea that there are people who are so committed to an ideology, who live and breathe this ideology, and ideologies generally, who have no problem causing great evil to accomplish their goals. They have no conscience about that. There are people like that, and if you don't believe that, then you're naive. Truly. Most people are good-hearted. Some are profoundly malicious, and we have to know that, or it's not a good thing for us. So, back to rules. Rule number 4, make the enemy live up to its own book of rules. And that is basically just that it's very difficult for most people to live by their own standards. Most of us have ideals of ourselves that are very hard to live up to. So when you force people to, you expose them and make them look less credible. But the reality is very few of us would stand up to our own sort of stated convictions when pressed. But especially when you are trying to target an organization, which is something else we'll get to, you target something specific and you crank up the volume on one of their promises. So you force them to respond to 30,000 letters or something rather than your normal one complaint, right? Which you know isn't tenable for most organizations, particularly if they're smaller. And when you've got sort of an army of radical left ideologues to accomplish this kind of thing, it becomes very easy to discredit organizations that you desire to discredit. Yeah, and it's not necessarily an excuse that someone can't live up to their credibility, but it's an abuse because most people can't, and they know that. They wouldn't be able to either if we turned it around, right? All right, rule number 5. Ridicule is man's most potent weapon. There's just nothing much you can say in response to ridicule, and it makes most people infuriated and off balance, and most people don't handle it well. And it's very effective because it stays with people. And this is one of those things where you have to decide how you're going to navigate that kind of ridicule, because often if you're good at turning it around, that can be very effective, but then you start, playing by their rules, and it's sketchy sometimes. But humor is very effective, and ridicule, more than humor, it's not rational, and it does effectively tear apart your target. So rule number 6 is a good tactic is one your people enjoy, and rule number 7 is a tactic that drags on too long becomes a drag. So both of these are just plugging into the realities of human nature, particularly when you're dealing with young ideologues. I'll tell a funny story in a second about that, but basically you want something that people just will want to do because it's kind of fun. Like people get kind of a rise from doing it, or they see the fruit of it, or they see that they're able to get somebody off balance. So you want to be kind of constantly changing that to suit the tastes of your ideological army. Now, it is pretty common knowledge that younger people tend to swing more socialist, and a lot of that is just lack of experience of the real world. And there's a kind of a beautiful idealism in youth, and I would never want to pop that bubble. I think it's a very important aspect, and I think it can be very powerful. But the reality is that as people grow up and they learn what real life is like and how hard you have to work to do well, and what it means to pay taxes and how much of your income goes to that, a lot of people, not everyone of course, but a lot of people actually phase out of it because they understand it more practically. They just understand how things are maybe more complex than their idealistic minds wanted to think. A really funny example of this is, I watched a video one time when Cardi B got her first paycheck, and I think she had been on social assistance most of her life prior to that. Sorry if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure. And she got her first check, and she knew she had made more than $1 million, and I think the check was $600,000, and she was flabbergasted that they had taken so much money from her without explaining why or where it was going. And it's just such a funny example of exactly that. Like, prior to her being the one giving that, it seemed really nice to have this other system. And I'm not making an assertion even here about taxes or Cardi B or anything at all, but it's just a really illustrating story about kind of the youthful lack of knowledge or lack of experience that many of us have early on, and then life hits us differently later on as we go. It's also why the radical left focuses so heavily on youth. Because they're more open to that kind of idealism. Rule number 8, keep the pressure on and never let up. This seems obvious. You just have to attack constantly. So if you're really trying to take an organization down, you just don't let them breathe. You just get them attacked from all sides so that they're just constantly off balance. All of their energy goes to fending off these kind of attacks rather than doing the good work maybe that they're trying to do. So actually the best strategy in response is to learn to, whenever possible, just not engage or not respond, because it will just drain out all of your resources financially, emotionally, professionally, economically. Everything will just be drained towards responding. Rule number 9, threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. And this is basically that when you sort of threaten people, it's actually helpful to do it as vaguely as possible, because they count on the human imagination to think up the worst thing possible. And that's kind of true. Organizations will expend a lot of time trying to brainstorm all of the different possibilities in order to mitigate damage if they think it's coming. And again, one of the fruits of a lot of these strategies is just to drain resources, just to get all of the focus away from your opponent's work and funnel it all instead towards just fighting you off. And then you leave people without money and time and resources to continue their work. And that's a very effective strategy. Rule number 10 is if you push a negative hard enough, it will push through and become a positive. So basically it's that if you push people hard enough, most people eventually snap. I mean, this is again human nature, and it doesn't take a terrible person to snap when you've been tormented in an extended way. It takes some heroic virtue not to, but they count on an eventual sort of violent response in some form, whether that's physical violence or more likely just some kind of retaliation that just doesn't look good to the public. And again, then they've accomplished their discrediting of an organization or a person, and that's very, very effective. And often the public has a tendency to sympathize with the underdog, so if you've done it right, then particularly if you can slant it in the media, then you've got the person by discrediting them. So it's something to watch for. Rule number 11, the price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. And that's not one I fully grasp the fullness of yet. So if somebody wants to comment below and flesh that out, I would love to hear from that. Or actually, if you have any thoughts on any of this, I would love to hear from you. If you've seen some applications, share below in the comments and see where you've seen it maybe. Rule number 10 is my favorite in the sense that I think it's the thing we see most clearly. And that is that you have to pick a target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. You have to pick very specific people or organizations. The more specific, the better. And you just hammer them, because then you crush them, but you also make everybody else afraid. Again, you're sort of indicating more power than you might have. And what it causes is a ton of backlash to that person, and you cause a lot of fear in anybody else that might want to, let's say, stand up or stand for something that opposes this bluffing monstrosity. So that's the playbook of the left. That comes from Saul Alinsky. Lots more to say about him. I encourage you to go and look around. He has some very well-known followers in politics and culture. So check that out. And I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe, like and comment, share, and I will see you next time.